The sky bled crimson as the sun sank into the Montana prairie, casting long shadows across the endless sea of grass. A fierce wind howled, carrying the acrid scent of smoke and the distant crackle of flames. The world was burning. Ember, a massive buffalo bull, stood atop a low rise, his hooves sinking into the parched earth. His dark eyes, deep as ancient rivers, gleamed with a quiet resolve. Scars crisscrossed his flanks, testaments to battles with wolves, rival bulls, and the cruel snares of men, but his heart thrummed with a purpose that transcended survival. Below him, his small herd huddled, their breaths heavy with fear. The fire was coming, a ravenous beast that devoured the grasslands with no mercy. Ember snorted, his breath a plume in the cooling air. His herd was not what it once was. Disease and drought had whittled it down to a fragile few: Sage, an aging cow with a limp from a long-ago injury; Thorn, a young bull barely past his first year, all bravado and no wisdom; and Willow, a calf so small her legs wobbled under her weight. They looked to Ember, their anchor in the chaos, but his gaze was fixed on the horizon where the fire's glow pulsed like a living thing. He could feel the heat already, a dry weight pressing against his hide. The prairie, once a cradle of life, was now a crucible. A low moan broke his focus. Sage had collapsed near a cluster of sagebrush, her sides heaving. Her bad leg, twisted from a hunter's trap years ago, had given out under the strain of their desperate flight. Ember lowered his head, nudging her gently. Her eyes, clouded with pain, met his, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. She could not run. Not anymore. But Ember would not leave her. Not yet. The wind shifted, carrying a new sound, a human voice, sharp and panicked. Ember's ears twitched. He turned, his massive head swinging toward the source. Through the haze, he saw a figure stumbling across the prairie, a girl, no older than 15, her clothes torn and streaked with soot. She clutched a small bundle to her chest, her face pale with terror. Behind her, the fire roared closer, its orange tongues licking at the grass. The girl tripped, falling hard, and the bundle, a blanket, slipped from her arms, revealing a tiny, squirming puppy. Ember's heart stirred. He had seen humans before, their machines tearing through the earth, their guns spitting death. But this one was different. Her fear was raw, unguarded, like that of a lost calf. She scrambled to her feet, scooping up the puppy, but her eyes darted wildly, searching for a path through the encroaching flames. There was none. The fire had encircled them, a noose tightening with every gust. Thorn snorted behind Ember, stamping his hooves. The young bull's eyes were wide, urging flight. "We must go," his posture seemed to say. "The fire will take us all." But Ember stood firm, his gaze shifting between Sage's crumpled form and the girl's desperate struggle. A choice loomed, heavy as the smoke in the air: lead his herd to safety and leave the girl to her fate, or stay and risk everything for a stranger who might never know his sacrifice. The girl's voice broke through again, a sob this time. "Please," she whispered, though to whom, she didn't know. The puppy whimpered, burrowing into her arms. Ember took a step forward, his hooves thudding against the earth. The ground trembled beneath his weight, a reminder of the power he carried, a power that had toppled rivals and defied storms. But it was not his strength that guided him now. It was something deeper, something that burned brighter than the fire itself, a flicker of compassion, alien yet undeniable, for a creature not of his kind. He bellowed, a deep, resonant call that echoed across the prairie. The herd froze, their eyes on him. The girl looked up, startled, her tear-streaked face catching the firelight. For a moment, their gazes locked, beast and human, bound by the shared instinct to survive. Ember lowered his head, his horns glinting like twin crescents, and took another step toward her. The flames were closer now, their heat searing his flanks. Time was running out. Miles away, in a dusty ranger station, Clara Holt sat hunched over a crackling radio, her hands trembling as she adjusted the dials. A forest ranger for 20 years, she had seen wildfires before, but none like this. The blaze had erupted without warning, fueled by a summer of unrelenting drought. Evacuation orders had gone out hours ago, but reports of stragglers kept pouring in. Her heart sank as the latest call came through: a girl, Mia, reported missing from a nearby ranch. Clara knew Mia's family, knew the grief they carried after losing Mia's brother to a car accident 2 years prior. The thought of another loss twisted like a knife in her gut. "Clara, we've got smoke jumpers en route, but the fire's moving too fast," the voice on the radio crackled. "No one's getting through that wall of flame." Clara's jaw tightened. She grabbed her gear: binoculars, a fire-resistant jacket, a map marked with evacuation routes, and headed for her truck. She wasn't supposed to go out alone, not in a fire this fierce, but Mia was out there. Clara had failed too many times in her life, failed to save her own marriage, failed to protect the land she swore to steward. She wouldn't fail this girl. As she sped toward the fire's edge, the radio buzzed with updates. Entire herds of wildlife were fleeing, their paths chaotic and unpredictable. Clara's mind flashed to the buffalo she'd tracked for years, a scarred old bull the locals called the King of the Plains. She'd seen him once, standing alone against a storm, unyielding as the earth itself. If anything could survive this fire, it was him. But survival wasn't enough, not for Mia, not for the land, not for Clara's own battered soul. Back on the prairie, Ember made his choice. He turned to Thorn, his eyes fierce. "Take Willow," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration in the air. Thorn hesitated, his youthful pride warring with fear, but he obeyed, nudging the calf toward a narrow gap in the flames where the grass was thinner. They bolted, disappearing into the smoke. Ember turned back to Sage. She was struggling to rise, her breath ragged. He pressed his muzzle to her side, urging her to stand, but she sank back, her eyes soft with resignation. "Go," she whispered, her voice a faint tremor in his mind. "Save the others." Ember's heart clenched. Sage had been his companion through winters and wars, her wisdom a steadying force when his own faltered. Leaving her felt like betraying the very earth he stood on. But the girl's cries pierced the air again, and the puppy's whimpers echoed like a call to action. Ember's gaze shifted to them, then back to Sage. The fire was closing in, a wall of heat and death. He could save one, perhaps two, but not all. Not without sacrificing himself. He took a step toward the girl, then stopped. A new sound cut through the chaos, a low, guttural snarl. From the smoke emerged a shadow, sleek and predatory, a mountain lion, its eyes glinting with hunger. Driven from its territory by the fire, it had scented weakness: the girl, the puppy, the wounded buffalo. It crouched, muscles coiling, ready to strike. Ember's roar shook the earth. He charged, his massive bulk a blur of power and purpose. The lion froze, caught off guard by the bull's ferocity. Ember lowered his horns, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a fire of his own, a fire born of love, of duty, of a refusal to let the world's cruelty win. The girl screamed, clutching the puppy tighter. The flames roared closer. And in that moment, Ember stood as a bulwark against death itself, his scars glowing in the firelight, his soul alight with a truth no flame could burn away: to protect was to live. What would you sacrifice for a stranger? For a family you chose, not born into? Ember's story is just beginning, a tale of courage, love, and the unbreakable bonds that defy even the fiercest flames. Subscribe to follow his journey and discover more stories of the wild heart of nature. The prairie was a furnace, the air thick with ash and the roar of flames. Ember's hooves thundered against the scorched earth as he charged the mountain lion, his horns lowered like twin blades. The predator's eyes widened, its snarl faltering under the buffalo's sheer mass. At the last second, the lion leapt aside, its claws raking the air, but Ember's momentum carried him forward, placing his bulk between the girl and the beast. His breath came in heavy bursts, each one a defiance of the fire and the predator both. The girl, Mia, froze, clutching the trembling puppy, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and awe. Ember wheeled, his dark gaze locking onto the lion. It paced, its tawny fur smudged with soot, hunger and desperation driving its movements. The fire had stripped it of its hunting grounds, and Mia, small, vulnerable, alone, was an easier target than a buffalo bull. But Ember was no ordinary prey. His scars told stories of battles won, of survival against odds that would break lesser creatures. He snorted, pawing the ground, sending up a cloud of dust that mingled with the smoke. The lion hesitated, its tail twitching, calculating. Behind him, Sage's labored breathing cut through the chaos like a knife. She lay where she'd fallen, her strength ebbing with every shallow breath. Ember's heart twisted. He could feel her fading, her spirit tethered to the earth by the thinnest thread. To stay and fight meant abandoning her to the flames. To save her meant turning his back on the girl and her puppy, leaving them to the lion's mercy. The weight of the choice pressed against him, heavier than any storm he'd ever faced. Mia's voice broke the standoff, a shaky whisper. "Please, don't let it hurt us." She didn't know if the buffalo understood, but her words were a plea to the universe itself. The puppy whimpered, its tiny body shaking in her arms. Ember's ears flicked toward her, catching the raw edge of her fear. He didn't know her language, but he knew suffering. He'd seen it in the eyes of calves taken by wolves, in the trembling flanks of his herd during drought. This girl, this fragile human, was no different. She was life, fighting to endure. The lion lunged, a blur of muscle and claws aimed at Mia. Ember reacted without thought, his body a wall of instinct and will. He swung his head, his horns catching the lion mid-air, sending it sprawling into the dirt. The impact shuddered through him, pain flaring in his old wounds, but he stood firm. The lion scrambled to its feet, snarling, but Ember advanced, his hooves shaking the ground. He bellowed, a sound that drowned out even the fire's roar, and the lion retreated, its hunger no match for the buffalo's resolve. Mia stumbled back, tripping over a root. She fell hard, the puppy tumbling from her arms. It yelped, scrambling toward her, but the flames were closer now, licking at the grass just yards away. Ember turned, his gaze darting between the girl, the retreating lion, and Sage's still form. The fire was a living wall, its heat searing his lungs. Time was a blade at his throat. Clara Holt's truck rattled over the uneven terrain, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The radio buzzed with static, the voices of her colleagues drowned out by the fire's relentless advance. She'd caught sight of the blaze's edge from a ridge, a crimson scar cutting through the prairie. Somewhere in that inferno was Mia, a girl Clara had watched grow up, a girl who carried her family's grief like a shadow. Clara's own losses, her husband, who left when the weight of her job became too much, the countless animals she couldn't save from poachers or progress, drove her forward. She wouldn't lose Mia too. Her binoculars caught a flicker of movement through the smoke, a massive buffalo, its silhouette unmistakable against the firelight. Clara's breath caught. It was him, the king of the plains. She'd heard stories from ranchers, whispers of a bull who'd outrun storms and outfought wolves. But what was he doing here, so close to the fire's heart? Then she saw the girl, a small figure curled on the ground, and her heart lurched. Mia. Clara slammed on the brakes, grabbing her fire blanket and a flare gun. The fire was too close for her truck to get through, but she could run. She had to. As she leapt from the vehicle, a new sound reached her, a low, guttural snarl. A mountain lion slunk through the haze, its eyes fixed on Mia. Clara's hand went to the flare gun, but before she could act, the buffalo charged, driving the predator back. Clara froze, her mind struggling to process the scene. This wasn't instinct. This was something more. Ember's chest heaved as he stood over Mia, the lion's retreat a fleeting victory. The fire was closer now, its heat a physical weight pressing against his hide. He turned to Sage, his heart splintering at the sight of her. Her eyes were half closed, her breath a faint rasp. He nudged her again, willing her to rise, but she only leaned into him, her warmth a fading echo of the cow who'd stood by him through countless winters. "Ember," she seemed to say, though no words passed between them. "You cannot save us all." He refused to accept it. He lowered his head, hooking his horns beneath her, trying to lift her. She was heavy, her body limp, but he strained against her weight, muscles quivering. The fire's roar grew louder, the smoke so thick it choked his lungs. Mia's coughs echoed behind him, sharp and desperate. The puppy's whimpers were fainter now, its strength waning in the toxic air. Ember's mind raced, memories flooding in, the day he'd fought off a pack of coyotes to save Sage's first calf, the nights they'd stood together under starlit skies, the quiet moments when her presence had been his only solace. She was his family, his anchor. But the girl, Mia, was a life he didn't know, yet couldn't abandon. Her fear, her fragility, stirred something in him, a spark of purpose that burned brighter than survival. He made his choice. With a final, gentle nudge to Sage, he turned to Mia. She was on her knees, cradling the puppy, her face streaked with ash and tears. Ember lowered his head, pressing his muzzle to the ground beside her. She flinched, then stilled, her eyes meeting his. There was no time for words, no time for understanding. He nudged her arm, urging her to move. She hesitated, then climbed to her feet, clutching the puppy tightly. Ember turned toward the fire, his massive form a shield against the heat. He began to walk, slow and deliberate, toward a narrow gap in the flames where the grass was thinner. Mia followed, her steps unsteady but determined. The puppy whimpered, its tiny body pressed against her chest. Ember's heart pounded, each beat a prayer that Sage would hold on, that the fire would spare her, that this fragile human would survive. But the fire was merciless. A gust of wind sent a wall of flames surging toward them, cutting off their path. Ember skidded to a halt, his hooves digging into the earth. Mia screamed, stumbling back. The puppy slipped from her arms, darting toward the flames in blind panic. Ember lunged, his horns sweeping low, scooping the tiny creature before it could vanish into the inferno. He held it there, trembling but safe, as Mia reached for it, her hands shaking. Behind them, a new sound broke through the chaos, a human voice, shouting Mia's name. Clara burst through the smoke, her fire blanket raised like a shield. Her eyes widened at the sight of Ember, the puppy cradled in his horns, Mia sobbing beside him. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the fire's roar fading to a distant hum. Clara saw not just a buffalo, but a protector, a creature defying the laws of nature to save a life not his own. "Mia!" Clara called, rushing forward. "We have to go, now." But Ember's gaze turned back to Sage, still lying in the sagebrush, her form barely visible through the smoke. The flames were closing in, a noose tightening around them all. He bellowed, a sound of anguish and defiance, and took a step toward her. Clara grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her toward safety, but the girl resisted, her eyes fixed on Ember. "He's trying to save her," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. "The other buffalo, he won't leave her." Clara's heart clenched. She knew the fire's speed, its hunger. There was no time to save them all. But as she looked at Ember, standing like a monolith against the flames, she saw something she'd never witnessed in all her years on the prairie, a creature choosing love over survival, family over self. The flames surged closer, and Ember made his stand. Would he save the girl and her puppy, or return to Sage, knowing it might cost him everything? What does it mean to choose between those you love and those who need you? Ember's fight is far from over. Subscribe to follow his journey through the flames and discover the power of a heart that refuses to break. The flames roared like a living beast, their orange tongues curling around the prairie, swallowing grass and sky alike. Ember stood resolute, his massive frame a dark silhouette against the inferno. The puppy, still cradled in the curve of his horns, trembled against his coarse hide, its tiny heart hammering. Mia clung to Clara's arm, her tear-streaked face turned toward Ember, her voice lost in the fire's relentless howl. Behind them, Sage lay still in the sagebrush, her breaths so faint they barely stirred the ash settling around her. The air was a furnace, each inhale a blade in Ember's lungs, but his eyes burned with a clarity that cut through the chaos. He had chosen to protect the girl and her puppy, but Sage, his family, his past, was a weight he could not release. Clara tugged at Mia, her voice sharp with urgency. "We have to move, now." She held the fire blanket aloft, a flimsy shield against the encroaching flames. Her ranger's instincts screamed to run, to drag Mia to safety before the fire closed the last escape route. But her eyes kept darting to Ember, to the impossible sight of a buffalo cradling a puppy, standing as a bulwark against the blaze. She'd seen animals flee in panic, driven by instinct, but this was something else. This was a choice. Ember's ears twitched as the fire shifted, a sudden gust sending embers spiraling like vicious stars. The gap he'd been leading them toward was gone, consumed by a wall of flame. He snorted, his hooves digging into the earth, searching for another path. The puppy whimpered, its small body slipping slightly in his horns. With a gentle toss of his head, he nudged it back toward Mia, who caught it with shaking hands. Her eyes met his, wide with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, though the words were swallowed by the fire's roar. But Ember's gaze was already back on Sage. The smoke was thicker now, a choking veil that hid her from view. He bellowed, a sound of raw anguish that shook the ground, and took a step toward her. The flames licked at his flanks, singeing his fur, but he pressed forward, driven by a force stronger than pain. Sage was his herd, his history, the one who'd stood by him when the world turned cruel. He could not let her die alone. Clara saw his movement and understood. "No," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You can't, there's no time." She grabbed Mia's shoulders, pulling her back, but the girl resisted, her eyes fixed on Ember. "He's going back for her," Mia said, her voice trembling with awe. "He's not leaving her." Clara's chest tightened. She knew the math of survival, seconds mattered, and the fire was closing in. But she also knew loss, the kind that carved hollows in your soul. She'd lost her husband to his own demons, lost countless animals to poachers and progress. And now, watching Ember, she saw a creature risking everything for love. It was a mirror to her own failures, her own choices to play it safe when she could have fought harder. "Stay here," Clara ordered Mia, thrusting the fire blanket into her hands. "Wrap yourself and the puppy in this. Don't move." Before Mia could protest, Clara sprinted toward Ember, her boots crunching against the scorched earth. She didn't know what she could do, drag a buffalo? Outrun a fire? But she couldn't stand by and watch him die for his loyalty. Ember reached Sage, his massive head lowering to nudge her side. She stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering open, clouded with pain but bright with recognition. "Ember," her gaze seemed to say, "you came back." He pressed his muzzle against her, his warmth a fleeting comfort against the fire's heat. But the flames were relentless, surging closer, a tidal wave of destruction. He hooked his horns beneath her, straining to lift her as he had before, but her weight was too much, her strength too far gone. Clara skidded to a stop beside him, coughing as the smoke clawed at her lungs. "Come on, big guy," she gasped, her hands fumbling for Sage's flank. She pushed, her muscles burning, but the cow was a mountain, immovable. Ember turned to her, his dark eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, Clara felt a connection that transcended species, a shared desperation, a shared refusal to give up. "We can't save her," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "But we can save you. And Mia." Ember's heart thundered, torn between the girl he'd sworn to protect and the cow who'd been his family. The fire was a noose now, tightening around them. He could feel Sage slipping, her life fading like the last light of dusk. He bellowed again, a sound that carried his grief to the stars hidden by smoke. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he pressed his forehead to Sage's, a final farewell. Her eyes closed, her body stilling, and Ember felt a piece of himself break away, carried off by the wind. He turned to Clara, his gaze fierce but not hostile. She nodded, understanding his choice. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the tears cutting tracks through the ash on her face. She ran back to Mia, who stood clutching the puppy under the fire blanket, her eyes wide with fear. Ember followed, his hooves shaking the earth, his massive form a shield against the flames that snapped at their heels. They moved as one, human, buffalo, puppy, toward a shallow dip in the prairie where the grass was sparser, the fire's grip weaker. Clara led the way, her ranger's instincts guiding her through the smoke. But the fire was cunning, shifting with the wind, and a new threat emerged from the haze, the mountain lion, driven back by hunger and desperation. It crouched low, its eyes locked on Mia and the puppy, its body coiled for another strike. Ember sensed it before he saw it, his ears pinning back, his body tensing. He swung around, placing himself between the lion and the humans, his horns lowered. The lion snarled, its claws scraping the earth, but Ember was a fortress, unyielding. He charged, a thunderous force, and the lion leapt back, vanishing into the smoke. But the effort cost him, his side was singed, his breath ragged, and a new pain flared in his shoulder where an old wound had reopened. Clara glanced back, her heart pounding. "Keep moving," she shouted to Mia, who stumbled forward, the puppy clutched tightly. Ember followed, his steps slower now, each one a battle against exhaustion and pain. The dip in the prairie was close, a faint hope in the chaos, but the fire was faster. A wall of flames surged toward them, driven by a sudden gust, and Clara realized with a sickening jolt that they might not make it. Ember sensed it too. He stopped, his massive head turning to survey the scene, Mia, trembling but alive, Clara, fighting with every ounce of her strength, the puppy, a fragile spark of life in the girl's arms. And behind them, Sage, now lost to the flames. His heart ached, but it also burned with a new purpose. He would not let this fire claim them all. With a roar that shook the heavens, Ember charged toward the flames, not to fight them, but to carve a path. His massive body crashed through the burning grass, his horns tearing through the underbrush, creating a fleeting corridor of safety. Clara grabbed Mia, pulling her through the gap, the fire blanket shielding them from the heat. They ran, their lungs burning, their hope tethered to the buffalo who led them. But as they reached the dip, a new sound pierced the air, a low, ominous rumble. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Clara's blood ran cold. The fire had weakened the earth, and a sinkhole was opening, a gaping maw ready to swallow them. Ember skidded to a halt, his hooves sliding on the crumbling edge. Mia screamed, clutching the puppy, as Clara pulled her back. The path to safety was gone, and the flames were closing in once more. Ember stood at the edge of the sinkhole, his eyes blazing with defiance. Would he find a way to save them, or would the fire and the earth claim their final victory? What would you do when the world itself turns against you? Ember's fight for love and survival burns brighter than ever. Subscribe to follow his journey and uncover the strength that defies even the fiercest odds. The ground groaned beneath Ember's hooves, a deep, guttural protest as the sinkhole widened, its jagged edges crumbling into darkness. The prairie, already scarred by fire, was betraying them now, its very foundation giving way. Flames roared on all sides, a relentless cage of heat and light, their orange glow reflected in Ember's dark eyes. He stood at the sinkhole's brink, his massive frame a monolith against the chaos, the singed fur along his flanks curling in the heat. Mia clung to the puppy, her face pale beneath a mask of ash, while Clara gripped her shoulder, her ranger's instincts battling the dread gnawing her gut. The path Ember had carved through the flames was collapsing, and time was a thief, stealing their last chances. Ember's breath came in heavy bursts, each one laced with pain from the reopened wound in his shoulder. The loss of Sage weighed on him like a stone, her absence a void that threatened to swallow his resolve. But the girl, the puppy, and now this human woman, Clara, were sparks of life he could still protect. His heart, battered but unyielding, thrummed with a truth he'd learned in the wild: to save another was to defy the world's cruelty, to carve meaning from chaos. He snorted, his head lowering as he scanned the terrain. The sinkhole was wide, its far edge barely visible through the smoke, but beyond it lay a stretch of unburned grass, a fragile promise of safety. The flames were closer now, their heat pressing against his hide like a physical blow. He could feel Mia's fear, sharp and raw, and Clara's determination, a steady pulse that matched his own. The puppy whimpered, its tiny body trembling in Mia's arms, and Ember's resolve hardened. He would not let them fall. Clara's voice cut through the roar of the fire. "There's no way across," she shouted, her eyes darting between the sinkhole and the advancing flames. She clutched the fire blanket, now singed and fraying, and pulled Mia closer. "We're trapped." But even as she spoke, her gaze fell on Ember, his massive form unbowed despite the pain etched in his stance. She'd seen animals flee or fight, driven by instinct, but this buffalo was different. He was choosing, again and again, to stand against the impossible. Ember took a step back, his hooves testing the crumbling edge of the sinkhole. The ground shifted, sending a cascade of dirt and rock into the abyss. He bellowed, a sound that vibrated through the earth, a call to the prairie itself to hold fast. Then, with a suddenness that startled Clara, he turned and charged along the sinkhole's rim, his head low, his horns sweeping through the burning grass. He wasn't fleeing, he was searching, carving a new path through the chaos. Clara's heart leapt. "Follow him," she yelled, pulling Mia along. The girl stumbled, her legs weak from fear and exhaustion, but she clutched the puppy tightly, her eyes fixed on Ember's form. They ran, the fire blanket flapping uselessly against the heat, the ground trembling beneath them. Ember's path led them parallel to the sinkhole, toward a narrow ridge where the earth seemed more stable, a fragile bridge over the chasm. But the flames were faster, surging from the side, cutting off their route. Ember skidded to a halt, his sides heaving. The ridge was their only chance, but it was narrow, barely wide enough for a human, let alone a buffalo. He turned to Clara, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't leading them to safety for himself, he was leading them for her, for Mia, for the puppy. His own survival was secondary, a distant thought in a mind consumed by duty. Clara's throat tightened. She'd spent years protecting this land, its creatures, its rhythms, but she'd never seen anything like this, a buffalo sacrificing everything for lives not his own. "Go," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't understand. "We'll follow." Ember stepped onto the ridge, his hooves testing the ground. It held, but barely, dirt crumbling beneath his weight. He moved slowly, deliberately, his massive body a shield against the flames that licked at his sides. Mia followed, her steps shaky, the puppy pressed against her chest. Clara brought up the rear, her heart pounding as she scanned the fire's advance. The ridge was their lifeline, but it was fragile, and the sinkhole yawned below, a hungry void waiting for a single misstep. Halfway across, the ground shuddered again, a deep crack splitting the ridge. Mia screamed, stumbling, and the puppy slipped from her grasp, tumbling toward the edge. Ember reacted instantly, his head swinging low, his horns catching the tiny creature before it could fall. He held it there, trembling but safe, as Mia reached for it, her hands shaking with panic. "I've got you," she sobbed, pulling the puppy back into her arms. But the crack was widening, the ridge collapsing under Ember's weight. He bellowed, his voice a mix of pain and defiance, and took a step back, urging Mia and Clara forward. The flames were closing in, their heat a wall that pressed against their backs. Clara grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her across the narrowing ridge, her eyes locked on Ember. "Come on," she shouted, but the buffalo didn't move. He stood firm, his hooves planted, his body a barrier between them and the fire. The ridge gave way with a sickening crunch, and Ember's hind legs slipped, teetering on the edge of the sinkhole. Clara's heart stopped. "No," she screamed, lunging toward him, but Mia held her back, her small hand surprisingly strong. "He's doing this for us," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. "He wants us to live." Ember's eyes met Clara's, and in them, she saw not fear, but resolve, a quiet, unshakable certainty. He snorted, his breath a plume in the smoky air, and with a final, thunderous step, he pushed forward, forcing the collapsing ridge to hold just long enough for Clara and Mia to reach the other side. They stumbled onto solid ground, the unburned grass a cool relief beneath their feet. The puppy yipped, its tiny voice a spark of hope in the chaos. But Ember was still on the ridge, the flames surging around him, the sinkhole pulling at his hooves. He bellowed again, a sound that carried his heart across the prairie, a farewell to Sage, a promise to Mia, a defiance of the fire itself. Clara turned, her hands clenched, tears cutting through the ash on her face. She wanted to run back, to pull him to safety, but the ridge was gone, swallowed by the earth, and the flames were a wall between them. Then, a miracle, or perhaps a gift from the prairie itself. A gust of wind shifted the fire, parting the flames for a fleeting moment. Ember saw his chance. With a surge of strength, he leapt, his massive body soaring over the sinkhole's edge, landing with a thud that shook the ground. He staggered, his wounded shoulder buckling, but he was alive. Clara and Mia rushed to him, their hands hovering, unsure whether to touch the creature who'd saved them. Ember's sides heaved, his fur singed and matted with blood, but his eyes were bright, burning with a fire that no blaze could extinguish. They were safe, for now, but the prairie was still burning, and the fire was far from done with them. From the distance came a new sound, the thrum of helicopter blades, the faint crackle of a radio. Help was coming, but the flames were relentless, and Ember's strength was fading. Would they escape the fire's grasp, or would the prairie claim them yet? What does it mean to stand when the world collapses around you? Ember's journey is a testament to the power of sacrifice and the bonds that defy even the fiercest flames. Subscribe to follow his fight and discover the heart that beats within us all. The prairie was a battlefield, scarred by fire and fractured by the sinkhole's maw. Ember stood on the unburned patch of grass, his massive frame trembling from exhaustion, his shoulder oozing blood where the old wound had torn open. The flames still roared in the distance, their orange glow a relentless reminder of the danger that encircled them. Mia clutched the puppy, its tiny body pressed against her chest, while Clara scanned the horizon, her ears straining for the helicopter's thrum. The sound was closer now, a faint pulse of hope, but the fire was a living thing, shifting with the wind, and their fragile sanctuary could vanish in an instant. Ember's breath came in ragged bursts, each one a labor against the smoke that clawed at his lungs. His eyes, deep and ancient, flickered between Mia, Clara, and the smoldering prairie where Sage had been lost. Her absence was a wound deeper than the one in his shoulder, a hollow that threatened to swallow his resolve. But the girl and the ranger, these fragile lives he'd pulled from the fire's jaws, were a tether to purpose. He had leapt the sinkhole, defied the flames, not for himself, but for them. And now, with the helicopter's promise drawing near, he felt the weight of their survival pressing against his battered heart. Clara knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his singed fur. "You're hurt," she murmured, her voice thick with awe and worry. She'd seen buffalo in her years as a ranger, proud, unyielding creatures of the wild, but none like Ember. His scars told of battles fought and won, but his actions spoke of something more, a choice to protect, to sacrifice, to love beyond the boundaries of instinct. She fumbled in her pack for a first aid kit, knowing it was woefully inadequate for a creature his size, but driven by a need to do something, anything, to repay him. Mia, still clutching the puppy, stepped closer, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and reverence. "Will he be okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The puppy yipped softly, as if echoing her question. Clara didn't answer, she couldn't. Ember's strength was undeniable, but he was not invincible. The blood pooling beneath him, the singed fur, the way his massive head dipped with fatigue, all spoke of a toll that even a king of the plains could not ignore. Ember snorted, his gaze shifting to the sky. The helicopter's roar was louder now, a mechanical beast cutting through the smoke. Its blades churned the air, sending ash spiraling like dark snow. Clara stood, waving her arms, her fire blanket flapping as a makeshift signal. "Here," she shouted, her voice hoarse. Mia joined her, holding the puppy aloft, its tiny form a beacon of life amidst the destruction, but the fire was not done with them. A sudden gust swept across the prairie, carrying a wave of embers that ignited the dry grass at their feet. The flames flared, a new wall of heat surging toward their sanctuary. Clara cursed under her breath, grabbing Mia and pulling her back. Ember bellowed, his voice a thunderclap that drowned out the fire's roar. He stomped the ground, his hooves crushing the burning grass, but the flames were too fast, too hungry. The helicopter was close, its shadow flickered through the smoke, but the fire was closer. Ember's eyes met Clara's, and in them, she saw a spark of defiance, a refusal to let the prairie claim them. He turned, his massive body moving with a grace that belied his wounds, and charged toward the advancing flames. His horns swept low, tearing through the burning grass, scattering embers and creating a fleeting barrier of cleared earth. Clara understood his intent, he was buying them time, carving a shield of dirt and wool against the fire's advance. "Mia, stay close," Clara shouted, pulling the girl behind Ember. The helicopter was overhead now, its roar deafening, its downdraft whipping the smoke into a frenzy. A rope ladder dropped, swaying wildly in the wind. Clara grabbed it, her hands slick with sweat and ash. "Climb," she ordered Mia, who hesitated, her eyes fixed on Ember. "He's saving us," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "We can't leave him." Clara's heart twisted. She knew the helicopter couldn't carry a buffalo, not one as massive as Ember. But she also knew they couldn't stay. The flames were closing in, the cleared patch shrinking with every second. "He wants you to live," Clara said, her voice breaking. "That's why he's doing this. Go." Mia nodded, her lips trembling, and began to climb, the puppy tucked inside her jacket. Clara followed, her eyes never leaving Ember. He stood like a mountain, his hooves planted, his horns sweeping through the grass, holding the fire at bay. The helicopter's pilot shouted something over the radio, his words lost in the chaos, but Clara caught the urgency. They had seconds before the flames overwhelmed them. Ember's strength was fading. The blood loss, the smoke, the relentless heat, they were eroding the fortress of his body. But his spirit burned brighter than ever, fueled by the lives he protected. He saw Mia reach the helicopter, her small form disappearing into its belly, the puppy safe in her arms. Clara was next, her hands gripping the ladder, her face turned toward him. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Ember felt a connection that transcended the wild, a shared understanding, a mutual vow to fight for life. The helicopter began to rise, its blade slicing through the smoke. Clara screamed, "Ember," her voice raw with desperation. She leaned out, reaching toward him, but the distance was too great. The flames surged, swallowing the last of the cleared ground, and Ember stood alone, a titan in a sea of fire. His bellow echoed, a sound that carried his heart to the heavens, a promise that he would not fall easily. But the prairie had one final betrayal. The ground beneath Ember shuddered, a new crack splitting the earth, a remnant of the sinkhole's collapse. He stumbled, his wounded shoulder giving way, and the flames leapt closer, their heat ablaze against his hide. Clara's scream was drowned out by the helicopter's roar as it pulled away, the pilot fighting to keep it stable in the turbulent air. Ember's vision blurred, the world narrowing to the fire's glow and the fading thrum of the helicopter. He had saved them, Mia, the puppy, Clara, but at what cost? His body was heavy, his strength ebbing like a river run dry. Yet even as the flames closed in, he felt a strange peace. He had chosen love over survival, duty over self, and in that choice, he had become more than a buffalo. He had become a story, a spark that would burn in the hearts of those he'd saved. The helicopter climbed higher, the prairie shrinking below. Clara clung to the edge, tears streaming down her face, watching as Ember's form was swallowed by the smoke. Mia sobbed, clutching the puppy, her voice a whisper. He was our king. But the fire was not the end. From the smoke emerged a shadow, massive and unyielding, moving with a purpose that defied the flames. Ember was still fighting, his hooves pounding the earth, his horns tearing through the blaze. Was it a final stand, or a path to survival? What does it mean to fight when all seems lost? Ember's story is a fire that refuses to die. Subscribe to follow his journey and discover the strength that burns within us all. The prairie was a cauldron, its air thick with ash and the unrelenting roar of flames. Ember staggered through the smoke, his massive frame a shadow against the fire's crimson glow. His shoulder bled freely now, each step a lance of pain, his singed fur matted with soot and blood. The ground beneath him trembled, scarred by the sinkhole's collapse, but he pressed forward, driven by a force deeper than instinct. The helicopter's thrum faded into the distance, carrying Mia, Clara, and the puppy to safety, a victory that burned bright in his heart, even as his strength waned. Yet the fire was merciless, and the prairie was no longer a home but a battlefield intent on claiming him. Above, Clara clung to the helicopter's edge, her eyes fixed on the shrinking figure of Ember below. Tears carved paths through the ash on her face, her hands gripping the rope ladder until her knuckles whitened. "He's still moving," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mia, curled in the helicopter's belly with the puppy pressed against her, sobbed quietly. "He saved us," she murmured, her words a prayer for the buffalo who'd become their guardian. The pilot shouted over the radio, urging them to strap in, but Clara couldn't tear her gaze away. Ember was a titan, unyielding even as the flames closed in, and she refused to believe this was his end. On the ground, Ember's vision swam, the world a blur of heat and shadow. Sage's loss was a wound that bled with every heartbeat, her absence a hollow he carried like a stone. But the memory of Mia's trembling hands, the puppy's fragile warmth, and Clara's fierce determination anchored him. He had given them a chance, and now he sought one for himself, not out of fear, but out of a stubborn refusal to let the fire write his story's end. A faint sound cut through the fire's roar, a low, steady rush, like the breath of the earth itself. Ember's ears twitched, his head lifting despite the pain. Water. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a river called, its voice a promise of salvation. The Missouri River, a lifeline that wound through the Montana prairie, was close, he could feel it in the dampness seeping through the scorched air. His heart surged, a flicker of hope igniting amidst the exhaustion. If he could reach it, he might yet survive. He turned toward the sound, his hooves pounding the crumbling earth. The flames pursued, a ravenous beast snapping at his heels, but Ember was a force of nature, his will a match for the fire's hunger. He stumbled, his wounded shoulder buckling, but he caught himself, his bellow a defiance that echoed across the prairie. The river was near, he could smell its cool, earthy tang, but the path was treacherous, the ground littered with burning debris and hidden cracks. Above, Clara leaned out, her binoculars pressed to her eyes. "He's heading west," she shouted to the pilot. "There's a river, maybe a mile out. If he can make it," her voice trailed off, hope warring with dread. The pilot shook his head, his voice crackling through the headset. "We can't go back, Clara. The fire's too thick, and we're low on fuel." Clara's jaw tightened. She knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning Ember twisted like a knife. She'd spent her life saving what she could, land, animals, people, but this buffalo had saved her, in ways she couldn't yet name. On the ground, Ember pressed forward, his massive head lowered against the heat. The river's call grew louder, a steady pulse that drowned out the fire's roar. But the prairie was not done testing him. A sharp crack split the air, and the ground gave way beneath his front hooves, another sinkhole yawning open. He roared, rearing back, his horns sweeping through the smoke as he fought to keep his balance. The flames surged closer, sensing weakness, their heat a hammer against his hide. Ember's mind flashed to Sage, to the quiet moments they'd shared under starlit skies, her steady presence a balm to his restless spirit. He saw Thorn and Willow, the young bull and calf he'd sent to safety, their futures uncertain but alive. And he saw Mia, her tear-streaked face lit by gratitude, the puppy a spark of life in her arms. These were the threads that bound him, the reasons he fought. He would not fall, not yet. With a surge of strength, he leapt, his massive body clearing the sinkhole's edge, landing with a thud that sent embers spiraling. Pain seared through his shoulder, his vision darkening, but the river's scent was stronger now, a cool promise just beyond the next rise. He pushed forward, his hooves tearing through the burning grass, his heart a drumbeat of defiance. Clara watched through the binoculars, her breath catching as Ember leapt the sinkhole. "He's still fighting," she whispered, her voice thick with awe. Mia clutched the puppy, her eyes red but fierce. "He's not giving up," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "He's our king." The helicopter banked, circling higher to avoid the thickening smoke. Clara's radio crackled, a voice cutting through the static, a ground crew, dispatched to the river's edge, reporting a possible safe zone where the fire hadn't reached. "If he makes it to the Missouri, he's got a chance," the voice said. Clara's heart leapt, but she knew the odds. The fire was relentless, and Ember was wounded, exhausted, alone. On the ground, Ember crested the rise, and there it was, the Missouri River, its waters glinting like a silver thread through the smoke. It was close, so close, but the flames were faster, a wall of fire surging from the east, driven by a sudden wind. Ember's legs trembled, his strength nearly spent, but he fixed his eyes on the river, its cool embrace a beacon in the chaos. Then, a new threat emerged from the smoke. The mountain lion, driven mad by hunger and the fire's chaos, slunk through the haze, its eyes locked on Ember. Its fur was singed, its movements erratic, but its claws gleamed, sharp and deadly. Ember snorted, his head lowering, his horns a crescent of defiance. He was weakened, bleeding, but he was still the king of the plains, and he would not yield. The lion lunged, its claws raking Ember's flank, tearing open a fresh wound. Ember roared, swinging his head, his horns catching the lion's shoulder and sending it sprawling. The predator scrambled to its feet, snarling, but Ember advanced, his hooves shaking the earth. The lion hesitated, its hunger no match for the buffalo's fury, and it fled, vanishing into the smoke. But the fight had cost him. Ember staggered, his vision blurring, the river's call fading as pain threatened to pull him under. The flames were closer now, their heat a tide that threatened to drown him. He took a step, then another, his hooves sinking into the scorched earth, each one a vow to reach the water, to live, to carry Sage's memory forward. Above, Clara's voice broke. "He's almost there," she whispered, her binoculars trembling in her hands. The river was in sight, but the fire was a wall, and Ember was faltering. Would he reach the water, or would the flames and his wounds claim him at last? What does it take to keep fighting when the world burns around you? Ember's journey is a testament to the heart that refuses to break. Subscribe to follow his path to the river and discover the power of a spirit that defies the flames. The Missouri River gleamed like a ribbon of hope through the choking smoke, its waters a stark contrast to the inferno that devoured the prairie. Ember staggered toward it, each step a battle against the pain searing his shoulder and the fresh gash in his flank where the mountain lion's claws had struck. His massive frame, once a fortress of strength, trembled under the weight of exhaustion, blood, and grief. The fire roared behind him, a relentless pursuer, its heat pressing against his singed hide like 1,000 needles. Sage's absence was a shadow in his heart, but the memory of Mia, Clara, and the puppy, safe in the helicopter's embrace, fueled his resolve. He had saved them, and now he fought for himself, for the chance to carry their story forward. The river was close, its cool scent cutting through the acrid burn of smoke. Ember's hooves sank into the scorched earth, each step slower than the last, his vision blurring as blood loss and fatigue clawed at his strength. The flames surged, driven by a merciless wind, their orange tongues licking at the grass just yards behind him. He bellowed, a sound that shook the air, a defiance of the fire, the pain, the prairie's betrayal. The river was his salvation, but it was also a challenge, a final test of the will that had carried him through storms and battles. Above, the helicopter circled, its blades a faint hum against the fire's roar. Clara leaned out, her binoculars pressed to her eyes, her heart pounding as she tracked Ember's faltering steps. "He's so close," she whispered, her voice thick with desperation. Mia sat beside her, the puppy curled in her lap, her tear-streaked face turned toward the window. "He has to make it," she said, her words a plea to the universe. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, reporting to the ground crew at the river's edge, but Clara barely heard him. Her focus was on Ember, the king of the plains, a creature who defied death to save them. On the ground, Ember crested a low rise, the river now a shimmering expanse before him. Its banks were lined with willows, their branches swaying in the wind, untouched by the fire. But the flames were relentless, a wall of heat closing in from the east, and the ground beneath him was treacherous, riddled with cracks from the sinkhole's collapse. He stumbled, his wounded shoulder buckling, and for a moment, he thought he might fall. His mind flashed to Sage, her gentle eyes, her steady presence through winters and wars. "Keep going," her memory seemed to whisper. "For them. For you." Ember pushed forward, his hooves digging into the earth, his massive head lowered against the heat. The river was mere yards away, its waters a promise of life, but the fire was faster, its embers spiraling like vicious stars. A burning branch fell across his path, igniting the grass at his feet. He roared, rearing up, his horns sweeping through the air, scattering the flames. The effort sent a jolt of pain through his flank, but he pressed on, his heart a drumbeat of defiance. Clara's breath caught as she watched through the binoculars. "He's fighting," she said, her voice trembling with awe. The ground crew's radio crackled, reporting a clear path to the river's edge where the fire hadn't reached. "If he can get to the water, he'll be safe," a voice said. Clara clung to the words, but the flames were a tide, and Ember's strength was fading. She leaned further out, ignoring the pilot's warning, her eyes locked on the buffalo who'd become more than an animal, a symbol of everything she'd spent her life fighting for. Ember reached the river's bank, the cool earth a fleeting relief beneath his hooves. The water was close, its surface rippling under the wind's touch, but the flames were closer, surging from the side, a final assault. He staggered, his legs trembling, his vision darkening. The blood loss was a tide pulling him under, but he refused to yield. He had saved lives, defied the fire, leapt the sinkhole. He would not let the prairie claim him now. With a final surge of strength, he lunged forward, his massive body crashing into the Missouri's shallow edge. The water enveloped him, cool and forgiving, quenching the fire's heat. He sank to his knees, the current washing over his wounds, carrying away ash and blood. The flames hissed at the river's edge, their advance halted by the water's barrier. Ember's breath came in shuddering gasps, each one a victory, a testament to the will that had carried him through the inferno. Above, Clara's cry of relief echoed in the helicopter. "He made it," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Mia clutched the puppy, her sobs turning to laughter, a sound as bright as the river's glint. The pilot banked the helicopter, circling lower, and Clara saw the ground crew moving toward the river, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. They were rangers, volunteers, locals, drawn by the fire's chaos and the story of a buffalo who defied it. Ember lifted his head, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight breaking through the thinning smoke. The river held him, its current a gentle embrace, soothing the burns and easing the pain in his shoulder. He thought of Sage, of her quiet strength, and felt her presence in the water's flow, as if she'd guided him here. He thought of Mia and the puppy, their fragile lives now safe, and of Clara, whose determination had matched his own. He had fought for them, and in doing so, had found a purpose beyond survival. The ground crew reached the river's edge, their voices a soft hum against the water's rush. A young ranger, barely older than Mia, knelt beside Ember, his hands gentle as he assessed the buffalo's wounds. "He's a fighter," the ranger said, his voice filled with awe. "Never seen anything like it." Clara's radio crackled, relaying the crew's plan to stabilize Ember and move him to a safe zone away from the fire's reach. But as they worked, a new sound emerged, a low, distant bellow, echoing across the prairie. Ember's ears twitched, his head lifting. It was Thorn, the young bull, his voice strong and clear. Somewhere beyond the river, he and Willow had survived, their path through the fire leading them to safety. Ember's heart swelled, a spark of hope amidst the grief. His herd was not lost, not entirely. He bellowed in return, a sound that carried his strength, his survival, his promise to lead them again. But the fire was not the only threat. The ground crew's radios crackled with a new warning. The wind was shifting, and a second fire front was moving toward the river. Ember's wounds were grave, his strength nearly spent. Would he rise again to face this new challenge, or had the river given him all the mercy it could? What does it mean to find refuge only to face a new storm? Ember's journey is a fire that burns eternal. Subscribe to follow his final stand and uncover the heart that defies even the wildest odds. The Missouri River cradled Ember in its cool embrace, its waters washing over his wounds, a fleeting balm against the pain that pulsed through his battered body. The flames hissed at the river's edge, their advance stalled, but the prairie was not done with its trials. The wind howled, carrying the ground crew's urgent warnings of a second fire front surging toward the river. Ember's massive frame trembled, his shoulder and flank oozing blood, his singed fur a testament to the battles he'd fought. Yet his eyes, deep and unyielding, burned with a fire no blaze could extinguish. He had saved Mia, Clara, and the puppy, carried Sage's memory through the inferno, and heard Thorn's distant bellow, a promise that his herd endured. But the fight was not over. Clara leapt from the helicopter as it touched down on a clear patch near the river, her boots sinking into the muddy bank. The ground crew swarmed around Ember, their flashlights cutting through the thinning smoke, their hands gentle but urgent as they worked to stabilize him. Mia followed, clutching the puppy, her face a mix of awe and fear. "He's still here," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. The puppy yipped, its tiny body a spark of life against the chaos. Clara knelt beside Ember, her hands hovering over his wounds, her heart heavy with the weight of his sacrifice. "Hold on, big guy," she murmured. "You've come too far to give up now." Ember's breath came in shuddering gasps, each one a labor against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to pull him under. The river's current soothed his burns, but the blood loss was a tide eroding his strength. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping the horizon where Thorn's bellow had echoed. The young bull and Willow were out there, alive, a thread of his herd that refused to break. He thought of Sage, her quiet wisdom, her gentle presence now carried in the river's flow. Anne. The ground crew's radios crackled, cutting through his thoughts. Fires shifting, a ranger shouted. "It's coming from the north, fast." The wind had turned traitor, driving a new wall of flames toward the river. The crew scrambled, their voices tense as they prepared to move Ember. But he was a mountain, his massive bulk too heavy for their stretchers, his wounds too severe for a quick retreat. Clara's jaw tightened. She'd lost too much, her marriage, her faith in herself, countless battles against the prairie's cruelties. She would not lose Ember. "Get the foam," she ordered, pointing to the fire-retardant canisters the crew carried. "We make a stand here." The rangers hesitated, their eyes darting to the approaching flames, but Clara's resolve was iron. "He saved us," she said, her voice steady. "We owe him this." Mia stepped forward, her small frame dwarfed by the chaos, and nodded. For Ember, she said, her voice fierce despite her tears. The crew sprang into action, spraying foam along the riverbank, creating a barrier against the fire's advance. Ember watched, his eyes half closed, his strength fading but his spirit unbowed. He felt the river's pulse, its ancient rhythm syncing with his own. It whispered of survival, of cycles that endured beyond any single life. He had fought for others, and now others fought for him, a bond forged not by species, but by shared will. The flames surged closer, their heat a hammer against the foam's fragile defense. The crew worked frantically, their shouts mingling with the fire's roar. Clara knelt beside Ember, her hand resting lightly on his flank, careful not to press his wounds. "You're not alone," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're here." Mia stood beside her, the puppy tucked into her jacket, her eyes fixed on Ember. "You're our king," she said, her words a vow. Ember's heart stirred, a spark of strength igniting amidst the pain. He shifted, his hooves digging into the riverbed, and with a low, rumbling bellow, he rose. The effort was agony, his wounds screaming, but he stood, his massive head lifting to face the fire. The crew gasped, stepping back, their flashlights illuminating his scarred, majestic form. He was no longer just a buffalo, he was a symbol, a testament to the wild's unbreakable heart. The fire reached the foam barrier, hissing and faltering as the retardant held. The wind shifted again, a sudden gust from the west, carrying cool air from the river and pushing the flames back. The crew cheered, their voices a ragged hymn of relief, but Clara's eyes stayed on Ember. He swayed, his strength spent, but he stood, his presence a shield for them all. The ground crew's radios buzzed with new reports. The fire was retreating, driven back by the wind and the river's barrier. Reinforcements were arriving, more rangers, a veterinary team, helicopters with water drops. Ember's wounds were grave, but the vet, a grizzled woman named Dr. Lena, worked swiftly, cleaning and bandaging his gashes. "He's a fighter," she said, her hands steady despite the chaos. "If he makes it through the night, he's got a chance." As dawn broke, the fire's roar faded to a distant crackle, the prairie smoldering but subdued. Ember stood in the river, the water lapping at his legs, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first light touched the grass. Thorn's bellow echoed again, closer now, and Ember answered, his voice weaker but unwavering. The young bull and willow emerged from the haze, their coats singed but their spirits intact. The herd was small, battered, but alive. Clara and Mia watched, their hearts full. "He did it," Mia whispered, the puppy nuzzling her chin. Clara nodded, tears cutting through the ash on her face. "He showed us what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." Months later, the prairie bore the scars of the fire, blackened earth, stunted grass, but life was returning. Clara stood on a rise, her ranger's hat tilted against the sun, watching a small herd graze in the distance. Ember led them, his wounds healed into new scars, his limp a reminder of the night he'd defied the flames. Thorn and Willow followed, their steps sure, their bond a testament to the family Ember had fought to preserve. Mia, now a volunteer at the ranger station, had started a campaign to protect the prairie, inspired by Ember's sacrifice. Her family, once fractured by grief, found healing in her passion, their ranch becoming a hub for conservation efforts. The puppy, named Ember in honor of the buffalo who'd saved it, bounded through the grass, a spark of joy in a world reborn. Clara had changed too. She'd left the station, taking a role with a wildlife trust, dedicating her life to preserving the land Ember had fought for. His story had spread, rangers, locals, even schoolchildren spoke of the king of the plains, a buffalo who'd stood against fire and death for a girl, a puppy, a stranger. A small marker stood by the river, a simple stone etched with a buffalo's silhouette, a tribute to Ember's courage. Ember himself felt the prairie's pulse beneath his hooves, its rhythm a song of endurance. Sage's memory lived in the wind, in the river, in the herd he led. He had lost much, but he had gained something greater, a legacy of love, of sacrifice, of a bond that transcended species. As he grazed, his massive head lifted, his eyes catching the light. He was no longer just a buffalo. He was a story, a fire that would burn in the hearts of those who'd witnessed his stand. What does it mean to leave a mark on the world? Ember's tale reminds us that love and courage know no boundaries, that a single heart can change the course of a fire, a life, a future. Share his story, and ask yourself, what will you fight for?